2015, a college student named Alex received a text from his roommate that simply read, "Don't come upstairs." Confused and concerned, Alex decided to investigate. What he found in their house led to a series of chilling discoveries that no one has been able to explain to this day. Alex Thompson was a 22-year-old senior at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. He and his best friend, Eric, had rented an off-campus house for their final year. It was nothing fancy, just a 2-story fixer-upper, but it had a cozy charm, and most importantly, it was affordable. The house had its quirks: creaky floors, drafty windows, and an attic door that never stayed closed, but Alex chalked those up to the house's age. One chilly October evening, Alex was finishing up an assignment in the downstairs living room. Eric had gone upstairs to his room about an hour earlier, saying he was going to bed early. At around 11:15 p.m., Alex's phone buzzed. It was a text from Eric. "Don't come upstairs." At first, Alex thought Eric might be joking. They were the kind of friends who pranked each other all the time, so he replied, "Why? You hiding a girl up there or something?" No response. A few minutes later, another text came through. "Please, stay downstairs. I mean it." Alex felt a pang of unease. Eric wasn't the type to pull a prank like this without giving himself away. He texted back, "What's going on? Are you okay?" Silence. Alex decided to call him, but Eric didn't pick up. Now genuinely concerned, Alex grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed for the stairs. As he climbed, he noticed how unusually quiet the house had become. The old house always made noises, groaning wood, the occasional squeak of a loose nail, but now it was eerily silent. "Eric?" Alex called out. His voice echoed faintly. He reached the second-floor landing and noticed something strange. The door to Eric's room was slightly ajar, and there was a dim light spilling out into the hallway. He approached cautiously and peeked inside. The room was empty. Eric's bed was unmade, his desk lamp was on, and his phone was sitting on the nightstand. But there was no sign of Eric. Alex walked in, feeling a chill despite the lamp's warm glow. Then he noticed something else. The attic door at the far end of the hall was wide open. Alex's stomach turned. That door never stayed open for long. The attic was small, dusty, and filled with cobwebs. They'd only been up there once during move-in and hadn't had any reason to go back. "Eric?" Alex called again, his voice shaking. No answer. Gripping his phone tightly, Alex approached the attic staircase. As he shone his flashlight up the steps, he noticed a faint scuff mark on one of the wooden planks, as if someone had been dragged. Against his better judgment, Alex started to climb. Each step groaned under his weight, and the air grew colder with every inch he ascended. By the time he reached the top, his breath was visible in the beam of his flashlight. The attic was empty, or so it seemed. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered as Alex scanned the space. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the only sounds were his own breathing and the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. Then he saw it. A hatch in the far corner of the attic floor that hadn't been there before. It was small, square, and made of the same wood as the attic floorboards, but it was slightly raised, as if it had been hastily built. Alex crouched down and touched the edge. The wood was unnervingly cold. As he lifted the hatch, a sudden gust of freezing air rushed past him, extinguishing the attic bulb. In the pitch darkness, Alex's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. What he saw beneath the hatch made his blood run cold. It was a staircase, spiraling down into what looked like endless blackness. Alex sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He knew their house didn't have a basement, and he certainly didn't remember seeing blueprints or anything that suggested a hidden staircase. The air coming from below was damp and carried a faint metallic smell, like rust or blood. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Alex began to descend. The staircase felt impossibly long. With each step, the air grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to move just out of reach of his flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the bottom. He found himself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and the floor was slick with moisture. At the far end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, with a faint, pulsating red light spilling out. "Eric!" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. As he stepped toward the door, he noticed something scrawled on the walls in faded, flaking paint. They were words, but not in any language Alex recognized. Sharp, angular symbols that seemed to shift and twist when he looked directly at them. When he reached the door, he pushed it open slowly. Inside was a circular room, and in the center was a large, stone altar. Eric was lying on the altar, unconscious, surrounded by a series of black candles that flickered unnaturally, their flames bending sideways. Before Alex could react, the door slammed shut behind him, and the candles extinguished themselves. The red light intensified, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. Then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper. The room began to shake, and the symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the light. Alex's flashlight flickered, and for the briefest moment, he saw something moving in the shadows. Something tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin. "Leave," the voice growled, echoing all around him. Alex grabbed Eric's arm and tried to shake him awake, but he wouldn't budge. The figure in the shadows moved closer, its angular limbs clicking with each step. "Leave," it repeated, louder this time. Alex tried to pull Eric off the altar, but it felt as if his body was glued to the stone. Panic set in as the figure loomed over them, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Eric, wake up!" Alex screamed. At that moment, Eric's eyes snapped open, but they weren't his eyes. They were pure black like twin voids. He turned his head slowly toward Alex and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Alex stumbled back, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the guttural whispers echoing through the room. Eric, or whatever was inhabiting him now, sat up on the altar, the candles around him sparking to life with a blinding blue flame. The shadows in the room coalesced, slithering toward the edges of the walls, forming a seamless, inky barrier that closed off every exit. "Eric, snap out of it!" Alex shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He could feel the oppressive energy in the air pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. "This isn't you!" The figure in the shadows clicked its jagged limbs, stepping closer. It towered over both of them now, its hollow eyes fixed on Alex. The guttural whispering had turned into a deep, rhythmic chant, reverberating inside Alex's skull. He clutched his head, feeling as if his brain might split apart. "You shouldn't have come here," Eric repeated, his voice layered with tones that didn't belong to him. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, and his mouth curled into a hollow smile. "It's awake now." "What's awake?" Alex stammered, stepping backward until his back hit the cold, damp wall. He could feel the ancient bricks trembling behind him, as if something enormous was moving just beyond them. "You disturbed it," Eric said, his body twisting as he stood, his limbs bent in impossible angles, and his black eyes bore into Alex's. It was buried for a reason. The altar began to glow, cracks spreading through its surface like veins of molten lava. The room shook violently, and Alex fell to the ground, his flashlight clattering away. In the dim, flickering light, he saw the figure in the shadows reaching toward Eric. Its spindly fingers, long and jagged, grazed the edges of the altar, and for a moment, Alex thought it was going to pull Eric into the void, but instead, it pointed at Alex. "You will carry it!" the figure hissed, its voice like nails scraping on metal. "You trespassed, you woke it, and now you belong to it." Before Alex could react, the altar shattered with a deafening crack. A wave of energy surged through the room, throwing Alex against the wall. He gasped for air, his vision swimming, and as the dust settled, he saw Eric's body crumpled on the ground, unmoving. "Eric!" Alex shouted, crawling toward him. His hands trembled as he shook his friend's shoulders, but Eric didn't respond. His body was cold, lifeless. "No, no, no," Alex whispered, tears streaming down his face. He looked around the room, desperate for a way out, for any sign of hope. The chanting had stopped. The shadowy figure was gone. But the oppressive feeling lingered, heavier than ever. And then Alex noticed the symbols on the walls. They were no longer glowing. Instead, they were seeping. Thick, black liquid oozed from the symbols, pooling on the floor and creeping toward Alex. Panicking, Alex scrambled to his feet, dragging Eric's body with him. He sprinted toward the door, which had somehow swung open during the chaos. The corridor beyond was pitch black, but he didn't care. He had to get out. As he ran, the sound of dripping liquid followed him. No matter how far he went, the black ooze seemed to be just behind him, whispering his name. He couldn't tell if it was real or if his mind was unraveling under the weight of the terror. Finally, he reached the base of the attic stairs. The hatch above him was still open, a faint beam of moonlight spilling into the void below. With every ounce of strength, Alex hoisted Eric's body over his shoulder and climbed. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he didn't stop until they were both back in the attic. Slamming the hatch shut, Alex collapsed onto the dusty floor, gasping for air. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened, but Alex knew better. He turned to Eric, his heart sinking as he realized his friend was still lifeless. The room felt colder now, the air heavier, and then, in the corner of his vision, Alex saw it. The shadow. It was standing in the corner of the attic, still, silent, watching. "Leave him," it whispered. Its voice was soft now, almost gentle. "Leave, and you may survive." Alex shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not leaving him." The shadow didn't move. Its form seemed to flicker, growing taller, more menacing. "You can't save him. You don't even know what you've unleashed." Alex's mind raced. He remembered the symbols, the black liquid, the voice that had called him a trespasser. It wasn't just about Eric. Whatever they had disturbed wanted more. "No," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll end this." He reached for the flashlight, the only weapon he had left, but when he turned back, the shadow was gone, and Eric's body was sitting upright. Alex froze as Eric's body began to move, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, the sound of cracking joints echoing in the silent attic. His eyes opened, but they were no longer his eyes. Dark, hollow voids stared back at Alex, unblinking. "Alex," Eric said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. It wasn't Eric's voice. It was layered, a chorus of whispers overlapping. "You've made a grave mistake." Alex backed away, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Eric, if you're in there, fight it. Don't let it take you." Eric, or the thing wearing his body, stood up slowly, its movements disjointed and unnatural. "This isn't something you can fight, Alex. It's already in you." Alex's stomach dropped. He felt a cold, creeping sensation in his chest, as if icy tendrils were winding their way through his ribcage. His breathing quickened, and he pressed his hand to his heart, trying to shake the feeling. "What are you talking about?" The entity wearing Eric's body smiled, its teeth unnaturally sharp. "You opened the door. You let it in. It's in your blood now, Alex. You're marked." Alex staggered back, his mind racing. He thought about the black liquid, The way it had chased him, the symbols on the walls. It had followed him out of the room, hadn't it? He looked down at his hands, half expecting to see the ooze seeping from his skin, but they were clean. "Lies!" Alex spat, trying to convince himself. "You're just trying to scare me." The thing laughed, a sound that sent chills down Alex's spine. "Scare you? No, Alex. You'll see the truth soon enough." Suddenly, the attic door burst open. Alex spun around to see the shadowy figure from before, now fully formed and taking up nearly half the room. Its hollow eyes bore into Alex, and the oppressive energy in the room became unbearable. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice reverberating through Alex's skull. "The mark is on you. Your soul is ours." Alex fell to his knees, clutching his head as a sharp, searing pain ripped through his mind. He felt as though his thoughts were being torn apart, piece by piece. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the entity's laughter. Through the haze of pain, Alex heard a faint sound. It was rhythmic, steady, a pounding noise. It took him a moment to realize it was coming from below, from the house itself. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and the entire attic began to tremble. The house was alive. The walls around Alex started to pulse, the wood stretching and contracting as though it were breathing. The beams above his head twisted and bent, the nails screeching as they were pulled free. The shadowy figure seemed to feed off the chaos, growing larger and more solid with each passing second. "You can't win," it said, its voice a low growl. "You are already ours." But Alex wasn't ready to give up. Through the searing pain and the overwhelming fear, he forced himself to stand. He gripped the flashlight in one hand and reached into his pocket with the other, pulling out the small notebook he had grabbed from the ritual room. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols and scribbled notes. Desperate, Alex flipped through them, searching for anything that might help. His eyes landed on a phrase written in bold, jagged letters. "Close the gate. Burn the mark." It was a long shot, but it was all he had. The attic began to collapse around him, the walls folding inward as the shadow surged forward. Alex tore a page from the notebook and pressed it to the pulsing wall. He held the flashlight to it, flicking the beam to its highest intensity. The light was hot, almost blinding, and after a moment, the paper began to smolder. The shadow let out an ear-piercing scream, recoiling from the light. "No!" it bellowed, its voice shaking the entire house. "You will not defy us!" Alex didn't stop. He fumbled for his lighter and flicked it on, holding the flame to the paper until it caught fire. The symbols on the page glowed a brilliant gold as the flames consumed them. The pulsing walls shuddered violently, and the shadow began to shrink, its form flickering like a dying ember. "You cannot undo what's been done," the shadow roared. "The mark is eternal." But Alex wasn't listening. He grabbed another page and set it ablaze, then another, each one glowing brighter than the last. The shadow shrieked and writhed, its form dissolving into wisps of black smoke. As the final page burned, the attic erupted in a blinding light. Alex shielded his eyes, feeling the heat of the flames engulfing the room. The shadow let out one last blood-curdling scream before it vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but silence. When the light faded, Alex collapsed to the floor, his body trembling. The attic was still, the oppressive energy gone. Eric's body lay motionless nearby, and for a moment, Alex thought it was over. But then he saw it, a faint, glowing symbol etched into his own skin. It was the same mark he had seen in the ritual room, pulsing faintly with an eerie light. The shadow was gone, but the mark remained. Alex staggered to his feet, clutching his arm where the mark burned like a brand. He stumbled out of the attic and into the night, the cool air a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the house. As he looked back at the crumbling structure, he realized the truth. He hadn't defeated it. He had only delayed the inevitable. As Alex stood outside the house, the cold night air biting at his skin, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the faint glow emanating from the mark on his arm. It pulsed rhythmically, like a second heartbeat, a sinister reminder of everything that had just transpired. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and uninviting, but Alex swore he could feel it watching him, waiting. He stumbled to his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. Each nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, to put as much distance between himself and that cursed place as possible. Finally, the engine roared to life, and he peeled away, the tires kicking up gravel as he sped down the deserted road. But the mark, it was spreading. By the time he reached the motel on the outskirts of town, the glowing symbol had crept up his arm like a sinister vine, branching out in jagged, intricate patterns. His skin burned as though it were on fire, and every time he tried to ignore it, the pain intensified, demanding his attention. Inside the room, Alex tore off his shirt and stared at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror. The mark wasn't just spreading, it was alive. The jagged lines moved ever so slightly, shifting and writhing beneath his skin. His stomach churned as he watched a thin tendril stretch from his shoulder to his chest, stopping just above his heart. Panic set in. He grabbed a knife from the kitchenette and held it to his arm, intending to carve the cursed thing out of his flesh. But as the blade touched his skin, the mark reacted. A searing pain shot through his body and he dropped the knife with a cry. Blood trickled from where the blade had nicked him, but the mark remained unscathed, the glowing lines mocking his feeble attempt to fight back. Alex sank to the floor, his back against the bathroom door. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. He reached for the notebook, flipping through its charred and battered pages, searching for something, anything, that could tell him what to do next. One phrase caught his eye, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting as before. The mark binds the soul. To sever the bond, return to the origin. The origin. The ritual room. The house. Alex's stomach dropped. The thought of going back to that hellish place made his blood run cold, but what choice did he have? He couldn't live with this thing inside him. It was already changing him. He could feel it, a creeping darkness taking root in his mind. The nightmares had begun before he even closed his eyes, visions of shadowy figures and whispers of ancient, unholy languages that made his ears bleed. By dawn, Alex was back in his car, driving toward the house. The morning light did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere of the countryside. Every mile closer to the house felt like a step closer to his doom, but he pressed on, the weight of the mark compelling him forward. When he arrived, the house looked different. The windows were no longer dark but glowed faintly, as if the building itself had come alive. The front door creaked open on its own as Alex approached, the air thick with the same oppressive energy he had felt in the attic. Inside, the house seemed to breathe, the walls expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic motion. The ritual room called to him, its pull undeniable. Alex's footsteps echoed in the hollow corridors as he made his way back to where it all began. The room was just as he had left it, the symbols on the walls faintly glowing in the dim light. The black ooze had returned, pooling in the center of the room like a dark, malevolent heart. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and Alex gagged as he stepped inside. The notebook trembled in his hands as he opened it to the last page. A single phrase was written there: "Offer what binds you." Alex stared at the words, confusion and dread twisting his gut. "Offer what binds me?" he muttered. What does that even mean? The mark on his arm flared, and he doubled over in pain. The glow intensified, illuminating the room as the black ooze began to rise, taking shape. The shadowy figure loomed before him once more, its hollow eyes fixed on Alex. "You have returned," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "But you cannot undo what has been done." Alex gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. "Tell me how to end this," he demanded, holding up the notebook. "What does it mean?" The shadow laughed, a sound that reverberated through the room and made Alex's bones ache. "The mark binds you to me. To sever it, you must give me what I crave most." Alex's mind raced. "What you crave most," he repeated. "What is it? My soul? My life?" The shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "No," it whispered. "Your fear." Alex froze. "My fear?" "You feed me with your terror," the shadow hissed. "Every scream, every shiver, every racing heartbeat strengthens me. If you wish to break the bond, you must face me without fear. Only then will you be free." Alex's chest tightened. How could he face this thing without fear? It was the embodiment of everything he had ever been afraid of. But as he stared into the shadow's hollow eyes, he realized he had no other choice. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. The mark on his arm burned hotter, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. When he opened his eyes, he met the shadow's gaze head-on. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering. "Lies," it spat. "You cannot deny your fear." Alex stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't control me," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You're nothing but a parasite, and I'm done feeding you." The shadow screamed, its form unraveling as Alex stood his ground. The mark on his arm flared one last time before fading into nothingness. The house shuddered violently, the walls collapsing inward as the shadow dissolved into the air. When it was over, Alex stood alone in the ruins of the house, the morning sun streaming through the broken walls. The mark was gone, and with it, the oppressive weight that had plagued him. For the first time in days, he felt free. But as he turned to leave, a faint whisper echoed through the air. "You cannot escape what lies within." Alex froze, a chill running down his spine. He shook his head and walked away, vowing never to look back. But deep down, he knew the shadow's words held a sinister truth. Some marks can never truly be erased. Months passed, and Alex tried to rebuild his life. He moved to a new city, changed his phone number, and even sought therapy to help him cope with what he told himself were hallucinations brought on by extreme stress. But no matter how far he ran, the memory of that night clung to him like a stain that wouldn't wash out. At first, things seemed normal. He found a job, made new friends, and even began sleeping without the aid of heavy medication. But then the dreams started. At first, they were subtle, shadows that seemed too dense, whispers that felt too real. Alex dismissed them as remnants of his trauma, yet each night the dreams grew darker, more vivid. One night he found himself back in the house, not the ruined shell he had left behind, but a pristine version of it, as if it had never been touched by time or decay. He wandered its halls, the eerie silence pressing in on him. When he reached the ritual room, the black ooze was there, waiting. It bubbled and writhed, and from its depths emerged the shadowy figure. "You thought you could escape," it hissed, "but you and I are bound." Alex woke in a cold sweat, his arm aching. He scrambled to turn on the light, and when he did, his heart sank. The mark was back. It wasn't glowing, but its faint outline was unmistakable, etched into his skin like a scar. The next morning he called his therapist, desperate for answers. Dr. Monroe listened patiently as Alex recounted his experiences, her pen scratching across her notepad. When he finished, she set the pad down and leaned forward. "Alex, trauma manifests in strange ways," she said. "It's possible your mind is creating these symbols as a way to externalize your fear, but if you feel there's something deeper, something more, I suggest confronting it directly." Her words echoed in Alex's mind as he left the office. Confront it directly. But how? He had already faced the shadow once and walked away alive. What more could it want from him? That night, the dreams returned, but this time, they were different. He wasn't in the house. He was in his apartment, surrounded by the familiar, yet everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces pulsing in and out. Shadows pooled in the corners, creeping toward him. And then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down his spine. "It's not over." Alex jolted awake, his heart racing. He glanced at the clock, 3:33 a.m. The room was bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of the mark on his arm. It was brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Determined not to let the fear consume him, Alex grabbed his laptop and started researching. He pored over forums, obscure occult websites, and anything that might give him a clue about what he was dealing with. Hours turned into days, and just when he was about to give up, he found something. A user on a forgotten message board had posted a story eerily similar to his own. They described a shadowy entity, a binding mark, and a desperate attempt to break free. The user claimed they had succeeded, but at a cost. They had to sever their connection to the mortal plane temporarily, entering the void where the entity originated, and severing the bond at its source. Alex hesitated. The idea of deliberately stepping into a realm of darkness and chaos made his blood run cold. But what choice did he have? The mark was spreading again, its glow brighter with each passing day. He could feel the entity's influence growing stronger, its whispers more persistent. The post included instructions for a ritual to access the void. It required specific items: salt, candles, and a mirror. Alex gathered everything he needed, setting them up in his apartment according to the instructions. As he lit the candles and traced the circle of salt, a sense of foreboding washed over him. When everything was ready, he stared into the mirror, his own reflection staring back at him. The instructions said to focus on the mark and repeat the incantation written below. As Alex spoke the words, the room grew colder, the flames of the candles flickering wildly. The mirror began to ripple like water, and Alex felt a pull, a force dragging him toward it. He tried to resist, but it was too strong. The world around him twisted and blurred, and suddenly he was no longer in his apartment. He was in the void. The air was thick and oppressive, a suffocating darkness that seemed to press against his skin. Shadows moved around him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The mark on his arm burned like fire, its glow illuminating the void in eerie pulses. "Alex." The shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, larger and more menacing than ever. Its hollow eyes bore into him. "You should not have come." Alex squared his shoulders, forcing himself to stand tall. "I'm here to end this." The shadow laughed, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot end what is eternal. You are mine, Alex. You have always been mine." Alex reached for the dagger he had brought with him, its blade etched with symbols he didn't understand. "Not anymore." He lunged at the shadow, the blade slicing through its form. The shadow let out a deafening scream, its form flickering and contorting. The mark on Alex's arm flared with blinding light, and he felt a surge of energy coursing through him. The void trembled, the shadows retreating as the light consumed them. Alex felt himself being pulled back, the world twisting and blurring once more. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his apartment. The candles were extinguished, the mirror shattered. He looked at his arm. The mark was gone, replaced by a faint scar. But as he sat there, catching his breath, a faint whisper echoed in the room. "This is not the end, Alex." Alex sat motionless, his heart pounding as the whisper faded into silence. He stared at his arm, the faint scar now glowing faintly in the candlelight. Was it gone? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? His breathing slowed, and for the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight of the shadow seemed to lift. But it hadn't vanished completely. That faint, lingering whisper echoed in his mind like a distant storm on the horizon. The days that followed felt eerily normal, almost unsettlingly so. Alex went back to work, catching up on emails and projects that had piled up during his absence. Nights were no longer haunted by vivid dreams or the burning mark, and he began to believe he had truly severed the connection. Then, one evening, as he prepared to sleep, he noticed something. The air in his apartment was heavy, almost humid, and there was an unnatural stillness. The faint hum of the city outside seemed muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. Alex scanned the room nervously, half expecting the shadow to emerge from the darkness. And then, it did. Not as the towering, menacing form he had faced in the void, but as a ripple, a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising off the asphalt. It hovered in the corner of his bedroom, undulating and pulsing with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. "I told you!" the voice hissed, low and guttural. "This is not the end." Alex scrambled to his feet, grabbing the dagger from his nightstand. It had been his constant companion since the ritual, a tangible reminder of his battle. He held it out in front of him, the blade trembling in his grip. "You're gone! I severed you!" he shouted, his voice cracking with both fear and defiance. The distortion grew, its form expanding and solidifying into something vaguely humanoid. "You severed nothing. You merely postponed the inevitable. We are bound, Alex. Always." The mark on his arm flared to life, burning like hot coals pressed against his skin. Alex screamed in pain, dropping the dagger as he clutched his arm. The shadow surged forward, enveloping him in suffocating darkness. Alex's mind raced. He thought of the void, the rituals, the blade. But nothing seemed to matter. The entity wasn't just haunting him, it was part of him now, embedded in his very soul. He could feel its presence in every corner of his mind, twisting and corrupting his thoughts. "You can't win," Alex gasped through gritted teeth. "You think you can take me, but I'll fight you. I'll fight you every second of every day." The shadow's voice softened, almost amused. "This is not a battle, Alex. This is surrender. You will succumb because you cannot live with me, and you cannot live without me." The word struck a chord deep within him. He felt his resolve waver, the weight of endless struggle pressing down on him. What if the entity was right? What if this fight would never end? What if this was his life now? A constant tug of war with a malevolent force that would never relent. But then, a spark ignited within him. A memory. The face of his sister, her laughter echoing in his mind. The way she used to call him her protector. The promise he had made to her that he would never let anything harm her. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for her memory, for the life he still had left to live. With a surge of determination, Alex reached for the dagger. The shadow recoiled as the blade made contact, its form twisting and writhing in pain. Alex pushed through the searing agony in his arm, slashing at the shadow with every ounce of strength he had left. "You don't own me," he roared, his voice echoing through the room. You will never own me." The shadow let out a deafening screech, its form dissolving into a cloud of black mist. It swirled violently around him before retreating into the mark on his arm. Alex fell to his knees, the dagger slipping from his grasp. The room fell silent, save for the sound of his ragged breathing. When he looked down at his arm, the mark was gone. Not just the scar, but any trace that it had ever been there. The weight in the air lifted, replaced by a strange, almost unsettling calm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alex was alone. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal. Alex kept the dagger, a silent reminder of his ordeal, though he never needed it again. He took up meditation, finding solace in quiet moments of introspection. The nightmares ceased, and the whispers faded into nothingness. But deep down, in the quietest corners of his mind, Alex knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was merely the calm before the storm.